Asked if I would fill in for him, and I only have to go from Ezekiel 21 to 24, which should be a cakewalk. But just since I've got the floor for just a moment, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the fall classes that we're going to start in September. The adult Bible classes we've polled the audience, as it were, and there's several people who would like to have a couple of options for adult Bible classes, and so we're going to offer two different Bible classes for adults. One will be the Bible Lands. Is that basically what it's going? Buddy's going to teach that. Of course, he and Ermedine were able to go to the Bible Lands earlier this year, and so he's going to be sharing some of the experiences that they had. It's not just a look at my vacation pictures class. I mean, it's a real class. I mean, there's some good stuff in there, and I know he's eager to get to share that. That's going to be in the old library, room 6, I believe is what we call that. And so that's going to be in that room, in between the hallways. Then we're also going to offer a continuation of the book of Acts, picking up in chapter 17 and going through the end of the book, hopefully. And Andrew and hopefully Gunnar will pick that up. And that's going to be what we call room 10, which will be that end of the annex. We'll close the dividers. And then the college age will be over here in this side. They were busting at the seams during last semesters, and we're looking at maybe 10 new students coming in this year. So it's going to be a bigger class. So we're going to put them in here in room 12, and I'll actually be teaching that class. It's going to be face-to-face with Jesus. So that's what the adult classes are looking like. So you'll have a choice between Acts or the Bible Lands, and I know those will both be good classes, and you'll be in good hands with those. Also, some have asked about the what we're doing at McCarty Student Center on Saturday. We've mentioned that it's a breakfast, but it's also a work day. And so just some of you have tools and expertise and skills, and you need to know what to bring. So just kind of a rundown of what was given to me. There's going to be some paint done on the outside. There's going to be some cameras that need to be hung. Some of the signs around need to be repaired. Some electrical work above the office area.
We took care of that.
We took care of that, Cliff said. Sort and organize shelves in the attic. Some sweeping and power washing on the sidewalks outside. There is sweep the area between the retaining wall and the building. Need a scoop along with a broom. So if you got a shop scoop or dustpan or something like that, repair some the private parking signage there, paint parking lines, haul away couches and glass from behind McCarty. I know that that's someone's new sleeping quarters, but I think we're going to tear that down and take away the couches, so that won't happen. But bring things that like if you got an extra paintbrush or like me, I've got a special paintbrush that I like that I don't let anybody else use. I don't know. I may not bring it up there because I may not let Martin use my paintbrush.
Bring a roller, but we need somebody with a chainsaw or two. The trees we had removed already got.
Okay.
Back 6 feet.
All right. So if you've got a chainsaw or two, I don't know why I guess if you've got 3 chainsaws, you use them for juggling. But for whatever you do, your chainsaw will work with. If you can bring that up here, that would be helpful as well. All right. And if you have any other questions or details, you can talk to Cliff or David, or probably Josh knows as well, and we'll get it all squared away. So that's going to be 7 o'clock. Is that right? 7:30 at McCarty. Okay, so get there. Don't get there late because you only get 30 minutes for breakfast. So get there in time to eat your breakfast. 7:30 to 8. 8 o'clock will be the start time for the actual work day. Okay, Ezekiel. We're in that section of Ezekiel, and Orrin has talked about this. And it's, there's some people who love the prophets and some people who hate the prophets, right? And I think a lot of people who aren't fond of the prophets, there's a repetitive message of judgment. We see it over and over and over and over again. And I think at some point we're like, okay, enough already. We know, we're bad. We should have changed. We didn't. But there's just these new and creative ways, really, to speak of God's judgment. But I don't think it's just God trying to give us inventive ways to say, look, you're doing wrong, and I'm going to judge you because of it. But the different depictions and pictures that he uses are important as well for what they show us. At the end of chapter 20, he says, when I tell them this, they're going to say that I am a writer or creator of parables. That word parable, when we think of parables, we're thinking of Jesus speaking or teaching in parables. And what's interesting is that word in the Hebrew can also mean something like a riddle or in hidden messages, that type deal. And so a lot of commentators, when they get to the end of chapter 20, where the fire that is burning and so forth, they see that as a riddle. And notice beginning in verse 45, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face toward the southland, preach against the south, prophesy against the forest land in the Negeb. Say to the forest of Negeb, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, behold, I will kindle a fire in you, and it shall devour every green tree in you and every dry tree. The blazing flame shall not be quenched, and all faces from north to south shall be scorched by it. All flesh shall see that I, the Lord, have kindled it. It shall not be quenched. And then I said, oh, Lord God, they are saying of me, is he not a maker of parables? Is he not a teller of riddles? Well, what's the riddle? And so a lot of commentators come into the first few verses of chapter 21 and say, this is the answer to the riddle. This is what God is talking about. The only problem I see with that is it itself is a bit of a riddle. Maybe it's not as clear, but what happens is basically the fire from the end of 20 becomes the sword in 21. And a lot of what you see in chapter 21 is about the judgment of God being pictured as a sword. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face toward Jerusalem. Preach against the sanctuaries. Prophesy against the land of Israel. So immediately we see this triple approach to the land of Israel, right? Jerusalem, sanctuaries. What's the sanctuary?
The Holy of Holies.
Right, the Holy of Holies, the temple.
The place where God is.
Yeah, it's the place where God is, which is Jerusalem, right? So set your face toward Jerusalem, preach against the sanctuaries, or Jerusalem, and prophesy against the land of Israel, the principal city of which was what? Jerusalem. So it's very clear here that God is speaking toward his people. And he says, behold, I am against you and will draw my sword from its sheath. Now, the problem that a lot of people have here is, who is the sword drawn against? Who does he say it's drawn against?
Says you, both righteous and wicked.
Righteous and wicked. Now, we're okay with God's judgment against the wicked, right? I mean, they're the wicked. They deserve whatever they get. But why is God drawing his sword against the righteous? And notice, he doesn't say it just once, but he says it twice to make it clear. This is judgment against righteous and wicked. What is the judgment of God going to come in the form of? Or what has it come already?
Disease, pestilence, conquest.
The what conquest?
Conquest.
Okay, captivity. The captivity. So when if we just understand the idea of the judgment of God being depicted as a sword, is in reality Babylonian captivity. Who went into captivity? Well, everyone, righteous and unrighteous, the righteous and the wicked. So it is true that the righteous and the wicked are both being punished in this sense. And so that's why we have to understand this judgment of the Lord, this sword that God has drawn. And he says there in verse 5, I've drawn it, and it will not be sheathed again. Until what? Well, beginning of verse 5, all flesh shall know that I am the Lord. When people understand who I am, again, when they come to that realization, then I will sheath it. But his emphasis here is on not putting it back in its sheath, which indicates what?
He's got it out and he's using
Or what?
it. He's got it out and he's using it. He is
Right, he's going to use it and use it and use it. And like if, consider yourself, if you were the sword bearer and you're going against people and you're, I don't mean to get too graphic, but you're slaying people left and right and left and right and left and right, and you never put your sword up, what does that say? That you keep slaughtering, right? The slaughter is ongoing. What if you do put your sword up? What if you stopped? Well, in this case, that would be a show of mercy. And that's what God is saying. Until this nation realizes who I am, there's no mercy. And that's hard for us to understand, because when we think of God, we think of love. We think of mercy. We think of compassion. And I was studying with a young man just yesterday, and we were talking about this concept of compassion and love and all these things. And I just said, well, that all that's true, but we have to understand that there is a judgment of God. And he said, well, I don't believe in a judgment of God. Well, it's hard to know who God is if we're only going to accept the parts about God that we like, and we're going to deny the things about God that we don't like. And that's a, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but that's a very immature concept of God. Because God is love, and God can still be love even when His wrath is on display. And that's the picture here. You, son of man, groan. This is what Ezekiel's supposed to do, groan. And the idea is to groan out loud with a breaking heart and bitter grief, groan before their eyes. Because, the idea of groaning is grief, sorrow. Why do you groan, you shall say, because of the news that is coming. Now remember, where is Ezekiel? Where is he physically located at this time? It says at the beginning of the book, he's at the Kibar River, right? The Kibar. So he's at the Kibar River, which is in Babylon. He's already in captivity, right? He's likely taken away in the first deportation of the 3 deportations that will take place. He's taken away in the first one, with others like Daniel and Azariah, Mishael, Hananiah. All of them were taken away in that first deportation. That's where Ezekiel is. But he's prophesying to the nation that remains in Jerusalem. So this message is for people who are far, far away from him. And it's about news that is coming. Well, is there more coming? Yes. The Babylonians, if he's taken away in the first deportation, what still remains in Jerusalem at this moment?
The majority.
Okay, the majority of people.
Like they took cream off of the milk.
Okay, they took the cream of the crop.
The first time. They
Okay,
took all the princes.
but what was central to Jewish life that still remained in that moment? The priest, but the temple. Yeah, the temple is still there. But remember, the temple will eventually be destroyed. So when he says bad news is coming, he's talking. Remember, he said preach against the sanctuaries. Right? This message is against. The temple is going to be destroyed. You know how devastating that would be to the people of Israel in that moment. Every heart's going to melt. All the hands will be feeble. The spirit will be faint. We get down to about verse 8. We sometimes verse 8 and 9 is an introduction to what we call the song of the sword. A sword, and you'll notice on my notes here, I don't know if you can see it up there, but I've highlighted in pink the word sword and how many times it's used in this chapter. A sword is sharpened and also polished, sharpened for slaughter. There's some branches of the military in their dress uniforms will wear a saber at their side. But that's for show, right? They're not carrying that into actual battle today. That's just for show. This one is not for show. It's not a show horse, it's a workhorse. It's there to slaughter. That's the purpose of a sword. And this one has been polished, and it's flashing like lightning. Remember the old, kung fu movies, and they pull out the sword and it's glittering, whirling around. There's actually a point in the chapter where he refers to it as the whirling sword. So we're talking, ninja style warfare going on here. So it's polished to flash like lightning. Verse 11, so the sword is given to be polished, that it may be grasped in the hand. It is sharpened and polished to give into the hand of the slayer. That's God. God is the slayer. He has set his will against the nation. So he's judging them for their sins. Obviously, as for you, son of man, prophesy, clap your hands. And there's a couple ideas here. Generally, in the Old Testament, the clapping of hands, there's a couple of instances where it talks of the creation is clapping almost like applause for God. But I don't think that's what he's talking about here. This is more like your mom who's trying to get your attention says, Sammy, you just stop doing that. That type deal. And so that's, you clap your hands at them. Not that my mom ever clapped her hands at me, but as far as you know. So let the sword come down. Notice, twice, yes, 3 times. That's something, in fact, we'll see it later in our lesson today. When something happens once, it's bad, or good if it's in a positive way. If it happens twice, that's really bad or really good, depending on the perspective. But if it happens 3 times, when you see something happening 3 times, that was like the superlative degree of something, right? It was the worst it could be, or it was the best it could be. And so, we would say good, better, best, or fast, faster, fastest, all right? The normal term, then you've got the comparative and the superlative. So when it's said 3 times, the superlative degree of something is the best. So the sword is going to strike not once, not twice, but 3 times. And so there's this depiction of this slaying, this judgment is going to be complete, and it's going to be ruinous. So you've clapped your hands. The sword is striking twice and 3 times for those to be slain. It's a great slaughter which surrounds them. And then notice in verse 16 and 17, cut sharply to the right, set yourself to the left, wherever you face it is directed. But most look at verse 16 as God turning from Ezekiel and now turning toward the actual sword. He personifies the sword. You cut to the left, you cut to the right. Wherever you face, you cut it down. And then God says, and I will do what? I'll clap my hands. Ezekiel, you clap your hands. Well, it's one thing for the prophet to clap his hands, especially if we're talking about it in an admonishing way. But now God is going to clap his hands. And for whatever aggression there might have been in Ezekiel clapping his hands, it is amplified in the fury of the Lord clapping his hands. And so here's the word, here's the message. Remember they said, why are you groaning? Well, for the message that's coming. What is the message? Well, the message is, the word of the Lord came to me in verse 19, as for you, son of man, mark 2 ways for the sword of the king of Babylon to come. Now, we're seeing how the sword is the judgment through Babylon. Okay, so they're connected to each other. The sword of the king of Babylon is to come. Both of them shall come from the same land, and make a signpost. Go out and at the road that splits, one to Jerusalem and one to Rabbah of the Ammonites. Put the signpost there. Point one to Jerusalem, one to Rabbah. All right, mark the way for the sword to come to Rabbah of the Ammonites, and to Judah, and to Jerusalem, the fortified. For the king of the Babylon stands at the parting of the ways, at the head of 2 ways, to use divination. He wants to know which way to go, the king of Babylon. And so there's 3 specific ways that he uses divination. One is the shaking of arrows. This was practiced by several ancient civilizations, including the Assyrians, the Babylonians, even the Romans practiced this. They would mark arrows toward the tips, put them in a quiver, shake them up, and then draw one out, like drawing a straw. And that, if whatever they drew, that would be the direction they go in this case. So that was one way of divination. The other one was to consult the teraphim. Where have we seen teraphim in the Old Testament before? Anyone remember? This is a little more.
Jacob was leaving
Here.
his father-in-law.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
idols.
That's right. So these are household idols. And Cliff is right. So when Jacob is leaving his father-in-law Laban and his wife Rachel steals the teraphim, right? These are the household gods. And so he would have had household idols with him, and he would have consulted these idols. I always find it funny how Jeremiah described, the idol, and he said, it's dumb. It can't speak to you. It's deaf. It can't hear you. If it moves, you've got to pick it up and movement. And if you offer it food, you've got to eat the food because it's an idol. It doesn't do anything. But here he's going to look at the teraphim or consult the idols. And the other thing he's going to do is what?
Look at the liver.
Look at the liver.
Is that like reading the entrails?
That's exactly what it is. We're talking about reading entrails. Hetopscopy is the technical term here, but I think it has to do with pouring the entrails of some victim. I don't know if this would be a human victim or an animal victim, but the entrails are poured out, and then remember Nebuchadnezzar had wise men, astronomers, and soothsayers that were part of his cadre of people. This is what they were trained in. They were trained in the arrows. They were trained in the entrails. They're trained in the tea leaves. They're trained to, figure something out in these things that made no sense. And what's going to happen is this divination is going to come for Jerusalem in verse 22. And he's going to set battering rams to open the mouth with murder, to lift up the voice with shouting, set battering rams against the gates, to cast up mounds, to build siege towers. But to them, and I think the them here is the Israelites, it will seem like a false divination. Well, that won't happen. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar's not coming our way. We are God's people. And so they are denying that it happens. But he says they've sworn false oaths. And we've mentioned, or at least Orrin has, about Zedekiah. Remember, Zedekiah was a regent. He was not technically a king. And Ezekiel is very careful in reference to Zedekiah to call him what? What term does he use for Zedekiah over and over? What?
Was it prince?
It is prince, yes, the word prince, which is, a lesser noble or a lesser ruler. And so here's this idea of Zedekiah, who had made an oath with Babylon that he would be king of Israel and have allegiance to Babylon, right? But he lied. That's what Cliff said. He lied. Yes, that's what they've sworn these solemn oaths, but he brings their guilt to remembrance. He lied. He'd made an oath. Now look, making an alliance with Babylon may not have been the best idea, but you don't make the oath and then go against it. And while he had sworn allegiance to Babylon, he was seeking alliance with who? Egypt. So he was a liar. Okay, skip down to verse 27. Verse 25 real quick. You, O profane, wicked one, prince of Israel, we're talking to Zedekiah again, whose day has come, the time of your final punishment. Thus says the Lord God, remove the turban and take off the crown. Things shall not remain as they are. You will not be in this position anymore. Now, he is part of the lineage of David. David was the rightful king. and his children after him that sat on the throne, what we would call a Davidic dynasty, the dynasty of David. And Zedekiah is along in that line, but I think he's not just speaking to Zedekiah in this moment, take off the turban, take off the crown. These were symbols of royalty. I think he's speaking of the whole Davidic line. Take them off. The kingship as you know it in the nation of Israel is over. Now, someone else is going to come along and take the turban and take the crown in the Davidic line. But until he takes it, no one is to wear it. And of course, the one that is coming is Jesus, right? Jesus Christ. So I think this is even a picture of messianic, a messianic interpretation, messianic prophecy. Exalt that which is low and bring low that which is exalted. Some of the same language that is, remember, preparing the way of the Lord at the beginning of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three. Is that right? The voice of the one crying in the wilderness. Exalt the valleys and humble the hills. The same basic idea. And then you get to verse 27. There's that ruin, 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 I will make it. This also shall be until he comes, the one to whom judgment belongs, and I will give it to him. I will give him the turban. I will give him the crown. When he gets here. But until then, this dynasty, this nation is going to face what? Ruin, ruin, ruin. All right, there's that triplicate. Ruin, ruin, ruin.
Pardon me, but isn't this also about the same time that Jeremiah crying in the wilderness, so to speak, has gone and told Zedekiah that they're coming and he needs to be aware and he turns his back on Jeremiah even?
Maybe. I'm not remembering that story that clearly.
Okay, maybe I just got it squeezed together, but seem to me like...
Well, this is at the same time.
To the one that's supposed to be on the
Yes,
throne.
yes. So it is, and Jeremiah is prophesying during this time. So yes, but I did not go back and reread Jeremiah to remember all the things he said. So again, you're probably right, but Jeremiah is contemporary with Ezekiel, and Jeremiah tells the people, you quit saying the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. See, there's that triplicate again. When things come in threes. Yeah. And so there is this utter ruin or destruction that is coming. I know we need to get out of chapter 21.
As well as the people that Noah told the flood was coming, it's coming.
Okay. Now, right at the end, verses 28 through the end of the chapter, he turns his attention away from Israel to the Ammonites. Now, who were the Ammonites? You want to remember?
They were part of Lot's descendants.
Okay, yeah, they were descended from Lot. Lot had two daughters that fled with him from Sodom, right? And they ended up getting Lot drunk and having relations with him, and so he fathered his own grandchildren. But it was Ben-Ami, who became Ammon, and Moab, who became the nation of Moab. And so the Moabites and the Ammonites came from, so they're kind of a distant cousin, we might say, to Israel. So he turns his attention to the Ammonites, who are more of an opportunistic predator. Because they see Israel as being beat down, they come in and they start to exploit the weakness of Israel in those moments. So they're more opportunistic. But they still receive the judgment from God. The sword is drawn for slaughter against them. But notice verse 30, it is sheathed. God will show them some mercy. But the nation of Israel was not going to have that mercy. In chapter 22, I highlighted the one in here. Instead of sword, it's blood. Blood is one that's it's mentioned over and over and over again. For you, and you, son of man, will you judge? Will you judge the bloody city? Will you go out and speak these words, declare to her abominations? And of course, the Lord God, He's angry with them for the blood that they shed. Verse 4 tells two reasons why they are guilty. One, by the blood that you have shed. Now this would be like oppression against the poor and the needy, murder, just the shedding of innocent blood. Any one of those things. That's the first reason. And the second reason is that the idols that you have made. So idolatry and cruelty. Those are the two basic sins of Israel. Are there other sins? Yeah. I mean, we'll see in a little bit. He gets very specific with some of their sins. But these are the two basic ones that God is upset about. He says that they are bent on shedding blood. Well, what does that look like? Bent on shedding blood, these princes of Israel. And I've just numbered, father and mother have been treated with contempt, sojourners suffer extortion, and so forth. There's 16 specific sins that he mentions in that paragraph, and you can look those up, maybe number those later, when you're doing your own private study there. So he is going to strike his hand at the dishonest gain that you have made and at the blood that you have shed. God is going to punish them, and he treats them in verses 17 through 22 as the dross. What's dross?
It's the slag from smelting.
Okay, it's the slag from smelting. So I've got some metal here. Let's say it's gold, or we'll say silver because that's what he uses here. So you got some silver, and you melt the silver down, and when it's melted down, the dross floats to the top. Now that's the dirt. He refers to it as other metals, tin and bronze and some of these. Lead. And then you take a cold steel or cold iron and you scrape off the dross. It sticks to the cold, and you're able to purify, in that sense, the silver, right? And God, in some of the other prophets, says, "I'm going to refine you like silver." What a great thing, that God would purify my life. But in this case, God purifies the silver, and the part that he scrapes off and discards, that's the nation of Israel. They are not purified silver. They're the trash that is taken off the silver to make the silver pure. You are the dross to me, he says. That's quite a shocking statement from God. Verses 23 through the end of the chapter then, he addresses 5 groups of people. Now, the ESV starts in verse 25, the conspiracy of her prophets. The Septuagint translation does not translate this as prophets, but as king. The idea of the king. So some of your translations may say king, or royal party, or princes, or some noble thing like that. And there's some other indications that probably king is the correct reading. And I tend to think it probably is, because if it is prophet, then he addresses the prophets down in verse 28 again. But if it's kings, and then you get down to verse 27 that mentions princes, this is the idea of nobles. So you have the king and you have nobles. And it makes more sense to me that he's addressing the way that it's set up, that he's addressing different people, and that it's likely that it's supposed to be kings. I wouldn't die on that hill. I mean, if you wanted to argue with me, it's not a point of contention, but it just makes sense that he addresses the kings. The kings who are they're the leader of the people, right? You think of King David and what King David offered to the nation. But if the king is not going to be righteous, they can rely on the priest to take care of him, lead him in the right direction, right? Except, verse 26, her priests have done violence to my law as well. Well, the noble people, the people that still love God, surely they would keep the law, right? But her princes in her midst are like wolves and tearing the prey and shedding blood. Well, at least God has sent all these prophets. The prophets will surely tell the truth. The prophets have smeared whitewash for them, seeing false visions and divining lies for them. So they can't trust the prophets. Who's left? Well, the people. Just regular Joe people. Surely they have it in themselves to keep the law. The people of the land have practiced extortion and committed robbery. In other words, at every level of society, corruption has entered in, and that's why they're being judged. And so the famous, these are one of the, there's like 7 or 8 verses we use out of Ezekiel on a regular basis. This is one I've heard a lot. I sought for a man among them who would build up the wall and stand in the breach, or stand in the gap before me. And I should not destroy it, but I found none. I looked for someone to stand in that gap between me and the people. Someone of the kings and the priests and the princes and the prophets and the people. Someone surely. He said, I found no one. I found no one. It's reminiscent to me of going back to Lot when the angels come through Abraham and he says, we're going down to Gomorrah now to destroy that city, or Sodom and Gomorrah. We're going to. And wait. What if we found like 50 people? 50 people. Would you save the? Yeah, I'd save for 50. And then Abraham, you hate to say it this way, but this way we used to always say, you juice him down to 10. And I know that's what that means. It is pretty pejorative, and I don't mean it that way. But that's what he does. He brings him down to 10. If I can find just 10 righteous people, now God is saying, look, I'm looking at them. I can't even find one. And they'll be destroyed. Chapter 23 is the parable, or I would say the parable of the 2 sisters, Aholah and Aholibah. Listen, if you're a new parent and you've got 2 kids, I would discourage you from calling them Aholah and Aholibah, because those names are just too close together. You might as well just call them all George. George 1, George 2, what George Foreman did, just named all of his sons George. It's kind of this way, Aholah and Aholibah. Although I will say, if you've got twins and they're girls and you name them these names, you must really hate your kids, because these are not good women, right?
They'll come back and get you.
Yeah. These are not good women. There are 2 women, the daughters of one mother, that we know they're sister. And I put my scary box around the word whore. We won't keep using that word all throughout this, but just notice the occurrences. God is describing them and their lives and what they're doing, and it's just. It's rather shocking to us to even read these words. And yet this is how God is describing His nation. So the first one, Aholah, verses 5 through the verse 10, Aholah is representative of the northern kingdom. In fact, he says here that they are mine, they're born sons and daughters. As for their names, Aholah is Samaria and Aholibah is Jerusalem. So we're talking about the northern kingdom, southern kingdom division again. The northern kingdom has already been destroyed. They've long since been lost to history as far as that goes. But he's reminding them. He says, I want you to remember who she was and what she did and how she played the prostitute with Assyria and all these others, and how bad she was. And she went to Egypt and all these bad things that she did. And so I want you to remember her, because you're worse. And that to me is a little shocking, because in most of my studies of northern kingdom, southern kingdom, you look at the northern kings, and wasn't any one of them good. And the southern kings, you had a handful that was pretty good, that maybe prolonged their life another 115, 200 years or so. But when God looks at him, He says, you're worse. I think they were worse because they had the presence of the temple. They had great opportunity. And yet they still went to these other nations. They still went against God. And so in verses 11 through about verse 37, really, he is describing Aholibah and her sins and how she has committed all these sins. And then in verse 36 through the end of the chapter, it is, I'm going to judge you. Here's the judgment. Because you've committed adultery, because the blood is on your hands. The committing adultery here, remember, is it represents idolatry. God, by going to the idols, they have committed adultery against God. They have prostituted themselves to these false gods. So it's the same indictment that we saw earlier in chapter 21, the shedding of blood and the idolatry. And here it is, the shedding of blood and idolatry again. Mentions with their idols they have committed adultery and have even offered up to them for food the children whom they have borne to me. In other words, they have sacrificed their own children to these idols. And we look at that and we're just amazed. No wonder he refers to them, who has been worn out by your adultery. I said to her of whom who was worn out by it all, you have tired yourself in your sin. And they shall return their lewdness upon you, these enemies, Babylon in this case. You bear the penalty for your sinful idolatry, and you will know that I am the Lord God. So now, verse 24 then, he tells Ezekiel, this day, hundreds of miles away in Jerusalem, Jerusalem is going to be besieged. The king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem in verse 2. He tells him, Ezekiel knows this by the revelation of God, not because someone has run from Jerusalem to come and tell him this. He knows it's happening simultaneously in this moment. And commentators place this on January 15th of the year 588. Now, exactly how they come to that date, I don't know. But it's difficult to try to line up the Jewish calendar sometime to our modern calendar, but something like that around that time frame, it's going to happen. And so God gives them this parable, and he calls them a rusty pot. You're a corroded rusty pot. A few years ago, my brother-in-law, I was at his house, and he said, come look at this, and he had this old cast iron Dutch oven. And it was as rusted and pitted as you could imagine. He goes, you want to take that and see if you can clean it up? And I said, no, I've already got a Dutch oven. No, actually, I do have that Dutch. I did take it. And I cleaned it up a little bit, but it's still rusted and pitted. And that's certainly what is happening here. And so they are the city of blood. Notice God says twice to them, verse 6, woe to the city of blood. And then again in verse 9, woe to the city of blood. You are this pot that is rusted and corroded. So what will I do? God says, I'm going to make a great pile, a heap of logs. Kindle the fire, boil the meat well, mix in the spices, and let the bones be burned up. He says, I'm going to judge you myself, and I'm going to light the fire. I'm going to burn you down. I'm the Lord God. I have spoken it. It will come to pass. I will do it. I will not go back. I will not spare. I will not relent. According to your ways and your deeds, you will be judged. And then we get to the hard part of chapter 24. When God says to Ezekiel, I'm going to strike your wife and she's going to die. Ezekiel is often looked upon as this very brash prophet. He's bold. His pronouncements of judgment are he holds no punches. He lays it all out there. And yet Ezekiel's like any one of us who we rely on our wives. And God said, this delight of your eyes is going to be taken away. And yet you cannot mourn. You can't cry about it. You can't put on signs and clothing and eat the food of mourning. You've just got to accept it. And when they ask Ezekiel, why are you treating it this way? He says, because God is going to take away the delight of your eyes, the temple. And you can't weep and you can't mourn because of your sins that God is taking it away. It's a pretty emotional reading when you look at it and consider what is happening in that moment. But God is using that as her death. I wish we had time to get into the possibilities of her death and how all that happened, things, but we don't have that time. But it's an interesting discussion on the loss of Ezekiel's wife and not being able to weep for her. All right, appreciate your attention. And yes. Oh, yes, yes. There's food is going to be put on the back table. I knew there was a third announcement. Food will be on the back table. Anyone can take that. I mean, it's going to go bad if you don't take it today. So get it out of here. Thank you.